As more refugees die trying to reach Europe, its leaders are trading blame. The French foreign minister has criticised Hungary's plans to build a wall along its border. But can Europeans reach a common solution? And are tighter measures on free movement really the answer? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mike Hanna. It's a refugee crisis with no precedent in the European Union's history. More than 300,000 people are now thought to have made the perilous journey to Europe this year, a number that continues to climb every day. The EU's response has been criticised. It as at best incoherent and at worst callous and inhumane. Under mounting pressure, the bloc has now decided to hold an emergency meeting that will be held in 2 weeks. Greece, Italy and Hungary have perhaps struggled the most with the number of people crossing their borders, but it's Hungary in particular that's been singled out for what's described as its harsh response, as Andrew Simmons explains now from the capital, Budapest.
For now, this is home for people who left war zones looking for sanctuary, and they can go no further. Many weren't warned not to buy international rail tickets. Police stopped them from boarding trains. This Syrian mother spent the last of her savings on non-refundable tickets. Now she regrets not paying people smugglers instead.
I feel angry. All countries helped us except Hungary. Macedonia let us cross. They let us use the train going to Serbia. Every day we walked hours to reach the border and my feet became swollen. I had to carry my baby all the way. I'm exhausted.
She has little help. There are only a few volunteers giving advice to the refugees.
We cannot only blame the smugglers, because we are giving an incentive for the smugglers and we're giving them better and better business by not letting these people take a train.
Hungary's government is ignoring all criticism about how it's handling this crisis. It stands accused of stripping away the rights of refugees. And it's preparing a raft of new legislation which could mean thousands of refugees are sent back to Serbia.
Nearly all of the refugees here have crossed from Serbia. Hungary is defining its neighbour as a safe third country, one of several changes.
Any asylum seeker who crossed Serbia will have no valid claim in Hungary. Their claim will be rejected at first sight without considering any protection need, without considering why they left war in Syria, in Afghanistan or Iraq.
Most of the efforts to help refugees are voluntary. Here, donated produce is being prepared to feed more than 1,500 people.
They just couldn't stay at home and see what's going on. All of us here feel that we are human beings and we should respect and treat these refugees as other fellow human beings, so that they would not feel that they are treated as animals and terrorists.
The Hungary are grateful for the help, but it's going to get worse for them. There are plans to clear so-called transit zones like this and enclose people in fenced-off areas away from the public. These people came a long way to end up like this, and it could hardly be described as sanctuary or refuge. Andrew Simmons, Al Jazeera, Budapest.
Well, Andrew Simmons also spoke to Hungary's government spokesman a little earlier. Let's hear what he had to say.
Now, let me put this clear. It's not about asylum law, but rather illegal border crossing, which we are trying to fix. It's completely unacceptable that over 150,000 people come through your green borders without any kind of discipline, order and law. So what we are trying to reestablish at the borders of Hungary and Serbia, which is a Schengen border, is law and order, put some kind of discipline into this huge influx of illegal migrants.
Discipline, order and law for refugees who are escaping from an absolute appalling war in Syria. Is that really the right approach?
It is the best interest of those arriving through the green borders, who might be refugees or who might be only economic migrants. We don't know, because they don't have papers. They don't have any way of proving their identities, to establish rules.
Well, let's now bring in our guests. In Brussels, Michael Diedring, Secretary-General for the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. In Oxford, Alexander Betts, Director of the Refugee Studies Centre at the University of Oxford. And in Budapest, joining us on Skype, Gabor Gyulai, Refugee Programme Coordinator at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. Welcome to you all. Let's go straight to Gabor Gyulai. We heard there from the Hungarian government spokesman appearing to argue that there's doubt about whether these people coming in are migrants or indeed refugees. He appears to be making a point out of that as a way of justifying the stringent measures that are being taken against them, is he not?
I think this explanation, besides being fundamentally erroneous, it cannot provide any explanation for such measures. Currently, over 80% of the asylum seekers who enter the EU at the Hungarian border, at the Serbian-Hungarian border, are war refugees. They are mainly Syrians now, then they are Afghans and Iraqis. And even the others, out of this 80%, or the 20%, remaining 20%, come from places like Eritrea, like Somalia, like Pakistan, countries with very serious human rights violations and problems. Asylum seekers in Hungary are more than ever genuine refugees. We see in our daily practice at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee families who lost everything, children who are suffering of diseases, who have suffered so much on the road towards Europe and also in Syria, in Afghanistan. We see families torn away. We see people who have been seriously tortured. Talking about these people as potentially economic migrants who merely want to come to Europe to work, to find a better life, is a fundamental lie. It also obviously shows that the Hungarian government does not understand at all what asylum means in a moral sense or in a legal sense. Hungary is a country that was home to several hundreds of thousands of refugees who sought refuge and a better life and escaping persecution in Western Europe during decades. I think it's an absolute shame that such a country is now playing the border guard of Europe and actually wants to violate the rights of hundreds of thousands of refugees.
Well, all of those points being taken, but Alexander Betts, is there perhaps the argument too that the sharp criticism of Hungary actually masks something that may be a far more fundamental problem, and that is there is no unified approach to this matter in Europe at all. Hungary bearing the brunt of criticism, but still no standardized policy.
So let's be really clear, the Hungarian position is likely to be highly untenable under international refugee and human rights law, but it's also a symptom of a broader challenge faced by the European Union. In theory, we have a common asylum and immigration policy, but at the moment, the whole of Europe is squabbling, and while it does so, people are dying. We need to reinvigorate Europe's common asylum policy. The only thing that European states agree on at the moment is the status quo is dysfunctional. The Dublin system that we have places a disproportionate responsibility on frontline countries like Hungary, Greece and Italy, while more distant countries like the UK, for instance, can stand behind lots of territory and lots of water and decline to play a proportionate part in sharing responsibility across Europe. We need responsibility sharing, we need international cooperation, and yes, the Hungarian position is atrocious, but Hungary and other countries need support, and we need leadership from across the European Union.
Let's just make clear the Dublin regulation that you referred to, introduced way back in 1990, actually specifies that people have got to apply for asylum in their first point of entry. So you have the scenario where those who manage to reach one country are then sent back to where they initially entered Europe. Michael Diedring, this is a almost procedural matter which many are using as an excuse. In the case of Hungary, we heard direct reference to the Dublin regulation in the government's response there.
Yes, over the past few years, Dublin has been used as an excuse. Well, it was the law, let's be clear. The Dublin regulation was the law and such should be followed. But as Alexander mentioned, I mean, it really leads to the worst consequences, and we are seeing that in this current situation, because you have states who are under tremendous pressure, and then if you were to follow the Dublin regulation, people would be returned back to these states, and so it would not allow them to be able to come out of the pressure situation that they're in. We do see some states, there are some glimmers of hope. For example, the German government just recently announced that they would not follow the Dublin regulation, and they have a right to do so, that they would keep the Syrian refugees that have come to Germany. They would not send them back. We've been calling for that, and this is another way for European states to be able to show solidarity, to show support by saying, if people have reached our borders, we will treat them as if they are filing their application here, and we will give them the support that they need.
Well, you mentioned an important point there. Germany has taken the lead in dealing with this unprecedented refugee crisis. Berlin says it expects a record 800,000 people will try to settle in Germany this year. And it's become the first country to suspend EU rules that force refugees to seek asylum in the first country they set foot in, which we were referring to. And last week, Chancellor Angela Merkel declared that all Syrian refugees who arrive in Germany are welcome to stay. Now, Gabo Ulay, for people like you working at the coalface of this problem in places like Hungary, others working in other parts of Europe, the sound of Alexander Merkel's statement there must come as some kind of hope, perhaps?
Yes, definitely. I think this is definitely not a solution, because the solution would be a true responsibility sharing system in the EU, and also the solution would be a functioning, humane and effective asylum system in Hungary, from which we are very far away at the moment, probably farther than ever in the last 15 years. But it's definitely, as you mentioned, it's a ray of hope. It may mean that many of our clients who struggle in Hungary, who have to sleep in the street close to the railway stations, who have really nowhere to go, who do not get any significant assistance from the asylum authorities and just depend on the grace and goodwill of volunteers, now have probably a chance to see a better future and go to Germany. It's just very recent news in Hungary that unlike yesterday and the news from the weekend, now it looks that asylum seekers are allowed by the police to actually board on the trains towards Western Europe. So something has changed again. This clearly shows that there is no stable policy decisions behind what is happening to refugees in Hungary. There is a new policy every day. There is a new law proposed. There are new nasty rules to limit access to asylum every week. So it's very difficult to cope with this situation. But this definitely gives us a little bit of hope, at least for our clients, even if not for our own asylum system.
Well, Alexander Betts, earlier this year, European countries got together to discuss this matter. They reached an agreement agreeing, it would appear, on the issue of burden sharing, spreading refugees more evenly through the EU's members' countries. This has now disappeared completely. It's no longer a law. It is purely voluntary, and many countries are actually ignoring it completely. This is a very clear example of how divided Europe is on the matter, and it would appear how many of these member states are intent on using such arguments to fail to reach a solution. Is that valid comment?
Absolutely. I mean, earlier this year, some proposals were put forward for better responsibility sharing in terms of the relocation of refugees across Europe and in terms of an augmented refugee fund to compensate the frontline states. That's all fallen by the wayside, and at the moment we have absolute division across European states. Germany is really exceptional in providing fantastic leadership and is an example to be followed. But I think the problem really with the politics of refugees in Europe is there's an asymmetry in a way. The frontline states are in the weakest position in terms of their bargaining power, whereas the more distant states, distant from asylum movements, can stand back and renege on responsibility. And so what we see is burden shifting all the way towards the source country. We see countries in Northern Europe being able to push responsibility back towards the Western Balkans and the Mediterranean. We see Hungary in turn looking to Serbia to take responsibility, and that goes all the way back to the region of origin, where ultimately we're pushing responsibility back to first countries of asylum in regions of origin. And that's just not tenable or sustainable. At some point, the more distant countries in Europe need to take responsibility. If we get this in proportion, there are 300,000 asylum seekers who arrived in Europe this year. That's not that many, and it should be manageable in the context of 28 European member states. Compare that to 3.5 million Syrian refugees divided between just Lebanon, Turkey and Jordan.
Well, Michael Diedring and Alexander Betts bringing out very fundamental points there at the burden shift towards the states on Europe's southern border, Italy, Greece spring to mind, having to deal with this while other countries push it away. Yet this is in itself a consequence of regulations that are in place. The Dublin regulations state specifically that this must happen. So we have a law in place, which Europe appears to be applying assiduously, well, many of the member states, which actually appears to be intensifying the problem rather than solving it.
Yes, and I think there's more and more recognition, even amongst the member states, that the Dublin system, the Dublin regulation, is not operating in the way it should, and that we need to look for changes. We need to look for a new system. Part of the problem, or part of the issue, is that what we have right now is an asylum system on paper that looks quite good. If you look at the common European asylum system and its components, and you look at it theoretically, it looks fine and it should work. The problem is that when you try to put it into practice, and when you have different member states that are unable to do so, then the system itself starts to collapse because you don't have other member states stepping in to cooperate. And I'll use Greece as an example. What's currently happening is that you have refugees and asylum seekers who are coming from Turkey and landing on the Greek islands. The Greek authorities are not able to provide reception, are not able to provide assistance. Part of that is because they're not prepared and they are still building an asylum system or rebuilding an asylum system in Greece. But the other issue is that what you basically have in Greece with the economic situation right now is a country that is incapable of providing that sort of assistance. So while Greece needs to be responsible, needs to step in, needs to step up, the European Union as well and the EU member states need to recognize that Greece is not the strongest of the EU members at the moment, and they need, as Alexander mentioned, they need to step forward with their own responsibility sharing, with their own efforts, so that we come up with a European solution to this problem. Because what we're looking at right now are different member states acting in their own interest. Hungary is one of the perfect examples, but there are others as well. So what we really need to do is bring the EU member states together again, come around an issue of solidarity, a solution of solidarity, and then start looking for this long-term European solution that's so needed.
Well, Alexander Betts, on this particular issue of getting the common policy, we saw the EU respond very quickly when Greece was facing a financial crisis. It held an emergency meeting in a matter of hours. We now have another emergency meeting on the refugee crisis, which is set for 2 weeks' time. Now, this appears to show a startling lack of urgency in a situation where hundreds of people are threatened on a daily basis.
It's remarkable how little urgency the European Union has placed this issue in terms of priority. I think people have been on holiday over the summer. Equally, the priorities in Europe have been the financial crisis and supporting Greece and the crisis over Ukraine. This migration and refugee issue has fallen right down the priority list. And I think now is the time, through this meeting on the 14th of September, for Europe to step up to the plate. It needs to offer two things. One, a clear policy vision on the way forwards, and two, a political strategy on how it can achieve collective action in the European Union. The strategy needs to involve a multi-pronged approach. We need a comprehensive global refugee policy for Europe that has to have three elements. A global level where we provide better responsibility sharing for countries and regions of origin like Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey. We need at the European Union level responsibility sharing and a new deal on responsibility sharing. And thirdly, at the national level, all European governments have to recognise and reassert that they have an obligation to reaffirm their responsibilities under the 1951 Refugee Convention to provide protection to refugees.
Now, Gabor Ulay, this clearly appears to be the way forward, but it also requires a political will that appears to be absent. I mean, would Hungary, for example, be prepared to start investigating this type of overarching solution at the behest of more powerful nations like Germany or others who might join this push to create some kind of unified policy which would benefit all those within the Union?
I think the case of Hungary is completely unique, and I obviously agree with everything that has been said about the European solution. But I think that what is happening in Hungary at the moment is quite particular. It's not the same as happening in Italy, in Greece, in Germany, in Austria, UK, or anywhere else. In Hungary, the current reaction of the government, and we have to understand this before I answer your question, is a continuation of a series of attacks on the rule of law, on democracy, on a democratic society, on media freedom, on the independence of non-governmental organizations. This really comes as a new element in this struggle of the government to increase its own power. That's why the government in Hungary is not interested in a solution. It has proved on various occasions. The Hungarian government has the power to provide a not perfect, but at least much better solution to this challenge. It has the money to do so. The country received several millions of euros from Brussels to improve its own asylum system. The numbers has started to go up 2 years ago. It's not something that started yesterday. There was time to get prepared for such a crisis. Yet it was not a priority. Nowadays, the priority of the Hungarian government is to keep this crisis on the front line of the media, of news, so that nobody talks about anything else in the country. Hungary is one of, unfortunately, the most xenophobic public opinions in the EU, so there is always a way to gain some votes to popularity with having a hard stance on refugees. However, what is really unique is that in Hungary now the number of asylum claims is very high. Most of them are really genuine refugees who are in need of protection, and therefore I believe that it's a true test for the common European asylum system. If the EU does not manage to take a hard stance on this situation and intervene and push the Hungarian government into this direction that you mentioned, to assume that we have obligations under the EU refugee law, then the whole idea of a common European asylum system simply fails.
Michael Diedring, I think we're hearing very clearly there a basic argument that the problem here is a political one. The technical solutions, the logistical solutions are pretty clear, but it's the political issues that appear to be dominating the debate, the why not tos rather than the how can we's.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest issues, and we've not yet touched upon this yet in our discussion today, is the fact that there are no safe and legal channels, or almost no safe and legal channels, for refugees to come to Europe. And that's the reason that you see them putting their lives at risk, taking very dangerous journeys across the Mediterranean, taking the journeys from Turkey to Greece. But then even when they arrive in Greece, there is still no legal way for them to continue to move on. And because of the situation in Greece, because there isn't sufficient reception, because there are no jobs in Greece, given the economic situation, these people are forced to move on in the same way they've been forced to move initially, to move from the war-torn areas in which they started. So the European Union itself is letting these people down, even from the point in which they are putting their feet on the ground. And it's really our politicians and the political system that is not willing to exercise the will necessary to say, we need to act, we need to respond to these human beings. And that's what we've been saying and others have been saying as well. This is a humanitarian tragedy. This is an issue of responsibility. This is not optional. The European Union and all the European member states have agreed that they have these legal obligations.
Alexander Betts, very, very quickly, a startling statistic. Between 2008 and 2014, 28 EU states never resettled more than 7,400 people in 1 year. Every year, on average, the US resettles 60,000 people. Clearly, this can be done, and in Europe should be done.
Yeah, around the world, only 28 states resettle refugees with a total population of around 100,000. Europe's way behind the US on this, with the exception of Germany with 30,000, with Sweden with about 8,000. Europe's not resettling enough refugees from desperate areas like Syria. It needs to do more. The purpose of resettlement is not that we can take everybody, but in part it's symbolically important to show reciprocity with host countries around the world. 95% of the world's refugees are in countries that neighbour conflict and crisis, and resettlement is a way in which we can demonstrate our commitment and thereby uphold a global refugee regime that is in danger and at threat unless Europe supports it.
Well, at that point, my thanks to our guests, Michael Diedring, Alexander Betts and Gabay Gilay. And thank you too for watching. If you have any comments about today's show, do get in touch by going to our program page at aljazeera.com or post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Mike Hanna, and the whole team here, It's goodbye for now.